Alright everyone, welcome back to another video. Last time we left off with the Republican Roosevelt, talking about Theodore Roosevelt and kind of a bit of what he did during his time as president and him as a person. If you don't know why they called him the Republican Roosevelt, well, you see, there's a Democrat Roosevelt, which I'm sure a lot of these people would have thought of first when they were reading this book at the time. But now we're on to the Crusade for Social Justice. Jackson was the symbol and, to a great extent, the leader of the agrarian democracy of the early 19th century. But he was not its sole cause and creator. Similarly, Theodore Roosevelt led the new crusade of the early 20th century. But the cause lay deeper than any one man. Just as the democratic movement of that early day reflected the pioneer spirit of the frontier, so the new reform movement reflected the readjustments of American society to an age of industrialism. This was not like the anti-slavery crusade, a single issue question. Many things were involved. There were agitations for Sunday political reform, or sundry political reforms, my bad, such as women's suffrage, popular election of senators, direct nominating primaries, but the major problems were economic, as they always are, right? Um, we have considered the farmers' revolt against the power of the railway and the great corporations. But there was an urban radicalism too. On the whole, American labor held a favorable position, or fewer immigrants would have poured into the country from less favored lands. But in times of depression, thousands were left without employment and wages were severely cut. Capitalism, in theory, meant free bargaining between employer and employed. But when it came down to actual practice, the big corporation could do without one more workman more easily than the workman could do without a job. Their only security lay in combination, but unionism then involved only a minority of the trade. A striking example of class antagonism was the Haymarket Riot of 1886. Some anarchists were making violent speeches in Chicago, and the police ordered them to disperse. A bomb was thrown, killing 7 policemen. Several anarchist agitators were hanged or imprisoned. But in 1893, John Altgeld, a reform governor of Illinois, pardoned the survivors on the grounds that there had been no proven connection between the anarchist orators and the bomb throwing. Altgeld again appeared in the limelight when, in 1894, there was a strike at the Pullman Cart Works. President Cleveland enjoined the strike, arguing that the Constitution gave the federal government jurisdiction over interstate commerce. Altgeld protested in the name of the states' rights of Illinois. Eugene Debs, the leader of the strike, became a socialist and was for many years the presidential candidate of the small Socialist Party. The most effective labor organization oh boy. Yeah, the most effective labor organization was the American Federation of Labor, organized um, by Samuel Gompers. Later, in the century, a rival organization, the Congress of Industrial Organization (CIO), was founded, and the two eventually merged. The railroad brotherhoods, the merchant seamen, and the miners had their own organizations. In the meantime, there was a parallel literature of exposure, sometimes called muckrakers, from a casual allusion by President Roosevelt to Bunyan's man with the muckrake, directed against political dishonesty and corporate greed. Among the group were Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, Rice Strand Baker, William Allen White, and the socialist Upton Sinclair. The women's suffrage agitation was first launched in New York State in 1848, but the initial victory came in 1869, when the territory of Wyoming adopted equal suffrage for all elections. This was reaffirmed in 1890 when Wyoming became a state. And by the end of the century, some Rocky Mountain states had full women's suffrage, and several other states had a limited suffrage for certain offices, such as school elections. The movement progressed slowly in the East, and not at all in the South, until the First World War. Although Anna Howard Shaw and Carrie Chapman Catt furnished able leadership. At the end of the war, it became national law through the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. There was nothing in the United States comparable to the violent tactics of the militant English suffragettes. The direct primaries issue needed or needs a word of explanation. Originally, the National Party conventions were the top of a hierarchy. First, the local caucus, attended by all party members who took the trouble to come. Then, the county and state conventions, since there was pressure at every state from a professional politician. The voters in November were really offered only a choice between candidates nominated by the Republican and the Democratic political machines. Now it became the rule for the voters to choose members of the conventions directly, and sometimes to instruct them on which presidential aspirant to vote for. By the 16th and 17th Amendments, uh, was authorized to levy a federal income tax, and the people at large, not as hereto the state legislatures, to choose senators. There were local movements to adopt the Swiss devices of the initiative, referendum, and recall, and for proportional representation, but these had no success except in a few western localities. Okay, that'll be all for that talking. But yeah, this is a time of great political reform. This is probably, I'm guessing they probably would say the 1870s to about the 1920s, really, is what this movement is. Not just in America, but all around. There is huge political reform. In America, there is some talk of socialism, but it's not very big. It's quite small, actually, compared to other places, especially in Europe. In Europe, socialism, very big potential. But not so much in America. America was just in general a little bit more resistant to it, you could say. Um, Still kind of is. Now it's just to a hatred of it, but back then it was just because of a man, didn't really work. People didn't really like those guys so much. Um, However, not just that though. There's obviously suffrage for everyone. There's all sorts of different things that just kind of all coalesce in this political time. And it's quite the interesting time. You have the rise of the industrial powers. A lot of it, people like John D. Rockefeller, for instance, Andrew Carnegie, a few others, of course. But um, you have the workers here that are very much, they don't have any power, and they are going to make their voices quite heard because, like they said, a business could shake off one worker, man, whatever. But a lot of these workers, they need jobs to survive, and so they're going to be very, very clear what they want. And you'll have Chicago being Chicago, even back then being. a point of political uh, extreme extreme measures, let's say. Um, and then you'll also have a lot of people rising to say, hey, look, we want this or this or that or this or that, all sorts of different things. Um, and these times will really kind of be, at least since the American Revolution, be the real hotbed of political talk. Slavery is no longer political talk. Now it's suffrage and so actually surprisingly they didn't talk about this, but I mean I guess we're talking about social justice right now, but there'll be the ban on alcohol. That'll be a ban on alcohol and things like that during this entire time too. So it's just a whole bunch of things all happening kind of at once. But now we'll get on to the pictures. At the far left here is on the 17th of July, 1877, during the railroad strike on the Baltimore and the Ohio Lane, some strikers went so far as to drag firemen and engineers from a freight train at Martinsburg, West Virginia. Yeah, you can see. Yeah, people, especially the railways. The railways get very much early on. Kind of government comes in and takes control of them. They're one of those very hotbed places, and the government kind of agrees. They're like, we should probably take charge of these. So they will. Um, Probably better that they did it sooner rather than later. Some of these workers on the railways, they were, let's just say, not too keen on quite a few things. The left here is an anarchist handbill announcing a mass meeting to be held at the Haymarket Square in Chicago on the 4th of May, 1886. When the meeting at the Haymarket Square began, a bomb was thrown at the police. Fighting followed, and the Haymarket riot ended with 7 policemen dead and 60 wounded. Of the strikers, 4 were dead and 50 wounded. Yeah, anarchism, very popular at this time as well as socialism. Socialism more so in Europe, like I said. Anarchism is popular both in America and Europe. But anarchism kind of died down some. Not fully. It still kind of exists today. But not like it did back then. People were much more, let's say, violent in their anarchist tendencies. So a little different now, but not much. Let's just go with that. At the left here is New York working men on strike the 10th of June, 1872. And you can see lots of men being very upset, but it's quite common. A lot of these guys, they were the ones that provided for their families. If they didn't have a job, their families would go hungry. They would maybe lose their house. They would do all this other thing. It's like these guys were upset. And if there's enough of them, you can change anything. If there's enough of you, especially in the American system, you can change anything. And then at the bottom here is the Haymaker riot. Yeah, pretty bad riot. Throwing a bomb, of course, not ideal for for political reform. Let's just go with that. Throwing bombs, not very useful for political reform. At the left here is Coxey's army in 1894. General Jacob S. Coxey of Massillon, I don't know, Ohio, had advocated that Congress issued $4,500 million in legal tender notes to be spent on building good roads, and wages of $1.50 per day would be paid to the workers who needed employment on these roads. He also recommended non-interest bearing bonds be floated to pay for the construction of schools, pavement streets and courthouses. To promote his ideas, Coxey organized a march of the unemployed on Washington. The march started on Easter Sunday, 1894, and on May 1st, 500 men arrived in the capital where they were arrested. Not necessarily a good look. Just gonna be honest. If these guys are at least peaceful, arresting all of them, technically it's actually illegal. They could arrest them, but if these guys are peacefully protesting, legally can't do that. But when has that stopped them before, right? Yeah, you have a lot of people being like, hey, if you put these reforms in, things will be good. But um, big business has a lot of a stranglehold, and it's starting now. Um, it still exists, obviously today. You could see big business's influence on the nation, but in some ways, they actually had more control back in this time than they do now. But who really knows actually? At the top here, the United States troops protecting a train during the Pullman strike of 1894. Yeah, a lot of these strikes, they'd have troops come in and kind of break it up. National Guard specifically. It happens quite often. A lot of these strikes, you'll have the troops show up. Sometimes for the best, and actually most of the time for the best, because you'll get to about the 1820s, 1810, or not 1820s, the 1910s, 1920s, and 30s, where some of these strikes will have businesses get men with guns, Pinkertons actually, specifically, and they'll have them stand between them, and then people will get shot and die. So happens a little too often there. But that is going to do it for this video. If you guys liked the video, leave a like. If you have any ways I can improve on these videos, leave a comment down below. I appreciate your feedback. And as always, subscribe. It really does help out the channel. Thank you.